Hello.
Hi, assalamu alaikum, how are you?
Wa alaikum salam. Good morning, Professor Razfar. Thank you for joining us again on our live show for your weekly Sunday segment. How's it going?
Everything's good, thank you.
Thanks for calling in, Professor. We're excited to hear from you, and we're excited to show the audience what it is that you would have to present for today. So let's get into it.
Yes, let's begin.
Yeah, so one of the questions that has been discussed recently and I've given some thought to is the question of freedom. We see that freedom is one of the most hotly contested issues, especially in the MENA region, in the Muslim majority countries. And of course, we were talking earlier about the oppression of the believers in Malaysia,
Yes,
which is considered, to be one of the more liberal
Muslim majority countries. Yes,
Muslim majority countries. But in general, what this got me thinking about was sort of the topic of freedom in a much broader sense. And if you notice in the Goal of the Wise, there's a conversation between Imam Ahmad al-Hassan and Abu Sadiq about this idea of freedom. And there's a particular excerpt that I wanted to sort of start with, which I think is will orient us to the entire topic.
oh, we would love that.
Sounds amazing.
So there's a discussion where they're talking about a verse from the Holy Quran, which is in Surah Al Imran, verse 133. I don't know if you guys can post that up or not, but I'll just read it really quick.
Okay.
It says, "Be quick in the race for forgiveness from your Lord and for a paradise whose width is that of the sky and of the earth, and it's prepared for the righteous." And in commenting on this verse, Imam Ahmad al-Hassan says, "A paradise whose width is that of the sky and of the earth. Paradise is on earth, my son." And so this is very important. Why? Because paradise is a place of freedom. And
Exactly.
And one of the things that I found very profound in the book is that, when you scan through, we'll just keep the focus on the Abrahamic faiths, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. There's this very famous idea about the divine attributes, right? So if you were to count them, there's 72 or so in the Torah and the Tanakh in general. And then you have the verse that speaks about the 13 attributes. But, of course, everyone knows in traditional Islamic arena is that there's 99 attributes, correct?
Yes, that's what
very
we know.
famous,
Mainstream, yeah.
So I was very intrigued that one of the attributes of God in the Goal of the Wise is Al-Hur.
Yes,
free.
it is. I love that name, and I loved that footnote. I remember when we read it the first time, it was that revelation of a new name of God that we didn't know about.
Yes, and I was actually shocked that this was not one of the 99 attributes, because it's actually one of the most obvious attributes, and it's actually the basis of our free will and why we are in the journey that we're in.
Mm-hmm.
And so if freedom is not one of the divine attributes in the traditional Abrahamic religions right now, it sort of helps you understand why this is how we know God, because in the very same page where this verse from Surah Al Imran is being discussed, there's this other quote that says, "We worship God not in fear of his hell, nor in desire of his paradise, but we worship him because he is worthy of worship."
Yes,
and this is
beautiful.
And this is the worship of the free, right? And so the whole basis, we see this theme echoed throughout the Quran, implicit. The one that is most famous is when, in Surah Yunus, there's this verses talking about how Pharaoh's body is saved as a sign.
Yes.
And the whole point is that his belief comes under compulsion, and this is not true faith.
Yes.
True faith has to come from freedom. And so any state that prohibits freedom, this is the conclusion I wanted to sort of get to. Any place, any society that prohibits freedom, it's the prerequisite for all the other attributes. It's a prerequisite for the conditions of knowing God. And so freedom, especially, we see this from the very beginning in the story of Iblis in the garden, is that Iblis is actually higher ranked than the hypocrites because he acts freely and he acts authentically and sincerely, even though he's wrong. But he's not. He's actually acting from a position of freedom and sincerity and authenticity, and so as a result, God rewards him for this. And there's these creatures below him that are known as the hypocrites, and they're the ones who are not actually acting freely. They're putting on a show. They're putting on a show of faith, a show of religiosity, a show of spirituality, and it's very performative. And so if we want to really delve into sort of why there's persecution of faith, especially in the Muslim majority lands, it comes back to how God is presented. And this attribute of being the free is missing in the list. And here we are reminding the world of this essential characteristic, and God wants us to be like him and to know him, and it cannot happen without freedom.
Yes, it's been a really hot topic recently on the show as well, where we've been talking about how essential freedom is and how God is free and loves freedom. But we also talked about the condition of the Israelites after their enslavement at the hands of the Pharaoh and what it did to their psyche, and how Moses' mission, part of it, was to step by step remove those yokes of slavery from their shoulders. And when a people have been psychologically enslaved for so many years, generation after generation, then the man appointed by God or the Caliph of God has this responsibility to slowly but surely break them from their shackles. And this process is traumatic in the sense that it requires certain disciplines to be put in place before one can really appreciate the beauty of freedom.
Wow.
And this is something that Alia and I discussed in the previous episode, and we would love to hear your thoughts about how enslavement warps the human mind and perception, and how it really requires a man appointed by God, inspired by God with the Holy Spirit, to break people of those chains.
Well, the person who's appointed by God and is basically fulfilling the role as a teacher is someone who has attained this level of freedom, and they are free from their lower desires. And they're free from what we call the ego, or the lower self, the nafs,
the base self.
Yeah, and so this is the condition, and so that means they have empowered the spirit, the soul, the spirit of God within them to be the driver of their existence. And so then the spirit of God is dominant within their being, and this becomes a tool, a vehicle for other people, in this case the students or the followers, however you want to term them. They're seeing that, and they're seeing how they, in their mind and in their body, the spirit that's within them is not dominant. The spirit within them is not, and this is the only way you can be truly free, is for the Spirit of God, because freedom comes directly from God, comes from the Spirit of God, and it's one of the attributes, as we were saying earlier. All the attributes actually manifest in the Spirit of God, right? So all the divine attributes are manifested there, and the only way another person can really learn it is to see it through that reflection, right? Through that veil. And so I think it's very important to emphasize that the person who becomes like a vicegerent is someone who has become free of all these enslavements, all these trappings of the world. And there's many of them, right?
Yes. There's so many aspects to it.
Right. And there's levels to this. And so that's why, we emphasize the 5 stages of development, right? We talk about the first stage is to recognize this truth, right? To recognize that there is a spirit. And then that's the level of belief. And then you move through these stages, and you can't do this without a teacher, someone who can reflect back to you, right? It's like trying to comb your hair without a mirror, right? If you try to comb your hair without a mirror, you won't be able to totally see, right? So the vicegerent is a mirror for our development. And the writings, the actions, all these things help us see it, and
right.
And that's the whole purpose of our journey to become more purified from the lower self, and to become more in touch with the one who's reflecting the clear light.
Yes, and we see this also very clearly in the allegory of the cave that Plato mentions, where, how can you free yourself when you've got your legs and arms bound together in chains? It needs somebody who has freed themselves from the chains to finally be able to untie you, because all you're looking at is, and I love this allegory because it really is a great way to try and understand that we are all enslaved, and we've been enslaved in the material world, and our perception is not looking at things as they really are. And by the way, this is one of the great prayers of the Prophet Muhammad. He used to say, "Oh God, show me things as they really are." This was one of his great prayers. And this is what the vicegerent of God sees. He sees things as they really are, whereas we are looking at this reflection of these images that are being presented on a wall in front of us, and we're completely chained down. And this is where your point, Professor Razfar, that it really takes a spiritually enlightened, free individual who has conquered the self, who has established discipline in his own self, who is guided by the very Holy Spirit of God, is necessary. It's a necessary must to have this individual before we, as his disciples, his followers, can also attain freedom.
Exactly.
Yeah, the allegory of the cave is one of my favorite allegories. I actually use it, excuse me, I actually use it to talk about the nature of language.
You, of course, being a professor of linguistics, so that must serve your purpose well.
Yes, and I was very happy to learn, and I was using this allegory long time before I actually learned that Plato was actually a prophet. I could always sense that he had prophetic qualities, but I never knew for sure. And when that was confirmed, and really that whole door was opened up, it just gave me more certitude that Plato and Socrates and Aristotle and that group were actually vicegerents, and they had reached a level of enlightenment. And so getting back to the allegory of the cave, I think there's so many different aspects to it. From a linguistic aspect, it was very fascinating for me because it tells us the nature of meaning, the nature of meaning making, that the shadows are sort of this literal level of meaning, but the real meaning is something above. But the real powerful thing for me was that when the being sees above the shadows and comes back to explain these higher levels of meaning, all these individuals who are in shackles and are imprisoned, which basically is a metaphor for those who are imprisoned by their 5 senses.
Right.
They start to fight him, right? They start to resist him, and so there's this dilemma: should the enlightened person come back to bring freedom to those who are in shackles? And of course, the answer is yes. It's an ethical responsibility to come back, even though they're going to fight him, they're going to resist him, and they're going to try to unalive him, right? And this is what we see. They want him to be in prison too,
right?
Because they're comfortable with those shadows.
Ignorance is bliss.
Ignorance is bliss, but is it really? You know, because ultimately, if I'm ignorant that I'm going to fall off a cliff, I'm still going to fall off a cliff, and it's going to hurt even more.
Exactly.
So I don't think ignorance is bliss.
No,
that's one of those expressions that's actually misleading. We should probably figure out who's the originator of that.
Yes.
You know, Brother Hussam al-Hakim has a take on that particular phrase, by the way, just throwing that out there.
Hear it.
He says ignorance is Iblis.
Iblis. So I like that.
I like that more.
Yeah.
I like that, Iblis.
Yeah, we should have that put on the cups as well.
On T-shirts.
Yes.
T-shirts, yes. Ignorance is Iblis. I love that one.
Yeah, maybe that's where that's one of the hidden etymological truths. Oh, I never thought of that. That's actually very interesting.
Yeah. No, I really like that point that you raised about Al-Hur being one of those. I mean, we have the 99 names of God. Some people have learned all 99 names, and they chant them in the morning and in the evenings, trying to seek the goal of getting nearer to God thereby. But the name Al-Hur is not mentioned. And of course, we always talk about that secret name of God. And I think when anybody thinks of God, you know, when we talk about the name Abdullah, somebody who is the slave and servant of God, and it is only through servitude and humble service to God that one becomes like God and ultimately reaches that state of freedom and manifests the name Al-Hur in the creation, as some of the prophets and the messengers did, you know, through their discipline. And of course, we know the story of Jesus, speaking of the name Al-Hur, when he was in the wilderness, he was in the desert, he was tried by the devil. This is mentioned in the Gospels, and he succeeds in each of these tests. And each of these tests is a chain. And before Jesus can rise to that level where he attains the freedom to walk on water, to heal the leprous and the blind, to do all the miracles that he did, to have the freedom to give life to the dead. I mean, that is some freedom that he was given by God. It is because he was able to become that perfect slave and servant of God, and then thereby discipline his own nafs, his own ego, and to stifle it into a position of subjugation. And then he became completely free. And to become free ultimately at the highest level, we were speaking about this a few days ago, Professor Razfar, is to then some individuals reach such a rank of servitude that they are able to say, like God, be.
And it is.
And it is.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I thought about as well, as you were talking, was in the story of Imam Hussein in Karbala and Ashura, there is a character who really embodies this attribute, and his name is Al-Hur.
Absolutely.
And for those who know the story, it's a very powerful story, because Hur is actually one of those who creates that encampment, right?
Yes.
He's the one he was an official of Yazid's tyranny, and he's responsible for entrapping and cutting off the water and doing all these things, but in the very last moment he decides to switch sides, right?
Yes.
And so this really shows sort of how he, in that story is sort of the manifestation of someone who's becoming free. Yes. But it also shows like the degree of his entrapments, because he's a high-ranking official. And basically, by him switching sides at that very high-leverage moment, it basically guarantees his death. But there's another issue I wanted to bring up, and that is all of the companions of Imam al-Hussein, we know from the book that they have returned in this time.
Yes,
right?
Of course.
And why is that important? Because in the story, we know, everyone knows, you could talk to anybody who knows the story, that one one of the prayers that they do before the night before, which is God, put me back in my body so I can experience this again. And so this is because they've tasted freedom,
Wow.
and they tasted freedom from the tyrant, right? And the tyrant is the person who rules in the name of God, but is not really from God. And,
Absolutely.
And we see many manifestations of that. And so Al-Hur is the archetype of freedom in this world, and sort of the freedom we should be embodying.
Yes.
I think it's also very significant that the idea of Imam Hussein's message, and we've said this a lot and we said it before on Rise Up as well, is that Imam Hussein was the true humanitarian. He was the true humane individual there, the only one who had humanity left and who was doing what he was doing to preserve the concept of being a true human being. And it was by preserving the freedom to truly pledge allegiance to God that he was a true human being. It seems to be that you would be reducing your own humanity by not allowing yourself to be free. It's very, very much linked, and it goes back to that hadith that we've also been discussing of how the human being can be reduced to the state of being an animal that is shackled, or it can elevate to being like an angel, which means that, again, it's all about freedom, like you're saying. If you're not free, if you're shackling yourself and allowing yourself to be shackled down, then essentially, are you even a true human being? That becomes a question to answer now.
What an aptly chosen name for Hur. He was Hur,
the free.
The free. He really was, because not only did he recognize that he was in the army of Iblis, when he saw the truth, when he saw the light, he recognized it. And he could have just said, look, I don't agree with this. And he could have walked back to Kufa, wherever he came from, and he would have gone back home to his family.
That's a great point.
But no, not Hur. He really did manifest that beautiful freedom. He decided to go from the encampment he was in the army of Yazid, and he defected and he went into the camp of Al-Hussein, knowing that he would be martyred. He walked to his imam and he was standing by his side.
With his son too.
With his son too. What a
True
great
freedom.
act of freedom. And what a great act of heroism. And this is really, a great example for us all to contemplate on and read about this individual. And this will happen again in history. There will be people who will become the horse of this age.
Yes.
We have been told, we know that there is a character called the Sufyani. We know that this character is the antithesis of the Mahdi. And he, like Yazid, confronts the Mahdi on the battlefield.
Yes.
And during that confrontation, there will be people who will defect from his camp into the camp of the Mahdi. And very disturbingly, there will be people in the encampment of the Mahdi
who will do the opposite.
Go the opposite way and enter into true slavery. And this really is a beautiful metaphor for freedom. And yes, I really think that this is something that I never looked at it this way before, but this truly is freedom when a man leaves behind that which he is comfortable in, and he says, no, ignorance is Iblis, and he walks to the army of his imam.
Yes, I really like the ignorance is Iblis statement.
Hassam's going to be happy. You approve of it.
Especially when we tie it to the idea of whoever dies not knowing the imam of the age has died the death of ignorance.
Exactly, the death of Iblis.
And Iblis has with all of his freedom and bravado, he expires, right?
Of course.
As Iblis, he expires. But even if you read the Golden Wise, even Iblis will have an opportunity to redeem. Because this is a very, complex story that spans eons, right? And so we have to really understand this in order to know who God is. And this idea of freedom, and this, I think, this is the one attribute, anybody who's out there can read this, how could the free not be one of the 99 names?
Yeah. It has to be.
And it has to be. I mean, it absolutely has to be. And the fact that it's not actually, should tell you something about how we've been presented who God is over the years.
Yeah.
And you won't see the attribute, the free, explicitly written out or spoken about, especially in the way that we're talking about it, where God wants us to become like him in even this act of creation, right? And his goal is not to just give us rules and rituals and things like that. The goal is to, if he does give us those things, it's as a means towards freedom, the true definition of freedom.
That's really beautiful.
Yes.
It's such a revolutionary way of looking at religion and truth, and to see like what is the true purpose of being in this world and being created at all. It's something much bigger than what people have made it out to be in the mainstream institutions, unfortunately.
Yeah, and even the idea of submission is actually a means towards freedom.
Exactly. In fact, the only means. You cannot be free without having your reins being held by the right individual, right? Someone in the driving seat. Who's going to be there?
Yeah, who makes you realize the Spirit of God within you, and this is the most important thing, is that he makes us realize the supremacy of God, and the supremacy of God cannot be achieved without freedom.
Yes.
And so anyone who claims to be speaking in the name of God, and it's interesting because you look at a lot of these so-called Islamic nations, their prisons are filled with political prisoners or prisoners of faith.
Anyone who dissents.
Right. Anyone who deviates from this core ideology. And so this is actually an indication, and even if you look at any nation, you can basically look at any nation who has a high number of prisoners, and at the same time that contradicts freedom. And you ask yourself, well, is this the goal of our creation, to create both physical prisons and also mental prisons?
And the Prophet Muhammad said it, didn't he? He said the world is like a prison for the believer. This is a very famous narration of the Prophet Muhammad.
Yes, and ultimately, just going back to the verse and the conversation about the verse in Surah Al-Imran, is that we're supposed to turn this world into paradise.
That's the goal, right? The kingdom of heaven on earth as it is in heaven.
The prison planet must become a paradise.
Yes.
This is the goal of the Mahdi.
And the goal of the wise.
The prison planet must become paradise. That's another good slogan.
Yes.
Alhamdulillah. I think this has given definitely given the viewers a lot of food for thought, and there are so many aspects to the conversation that were discussed that come from the goal of the wise. So anyone out there who's curious to know more and is wanting to understand how to know this better, check out the goal of the wise to understand why our faith is the way it is, why we believe in this concept so strongly, and how we are free as people thanks to the mercy and grace of the Qaim of the family of Muhammad, Abdullah Hashim Abu Sadiq. And thank you so much, Professor Razfar, for taking the time to actually break this down for all of us. It's really beneficial, I think, for everyone.
It was beautiful, and to hear you talk about these parallels on the plains of Karbala, and how Hur was the true manifestation of the name freedom, and how the Imams of the Ahlul Bayt, they really did reach the highest level of monotheism. And we know about the concept in the school of the Ahlul Bayt that talks about Wilayat al-Taqwiniyya.
Yes.
I mean, my goodness, talk about reaching freedom. And this is another topic. I don't know if you wanted to say a brief word about that, Professor.
About that type of wilayat?
Yeah, because I think it would be alien to a lot of ears, particularly in the non-Shia world, who don't know about the Prophet's family, his progeny.
Even in the Shia world, and the Gnostic understanding of it is very limiting.
Yeah, I don't know if we have time, but I mean, basically, when a person reaches that rank of freedom or being God in creation, then they also acquire the same kinds of powers and authorities over creation and over the creative process. And And we see this in the story of many of the prophets, like Jesus, for example. We see that where he has the ability to say, "Be and it is."
Yes.
Yes.
And those things become manifest. And of course, we see this in all of the Ahlul Bayt. And we know Jesus is part of the Ahlul Kisa, the people of the cloak. You've talked about this in previous sessions. And I think that's something that's also new for the people, that Prophet Muhammad, during his entire work as a prophet, was through the angel Gabriel, but Gabriel was a person who is Jesus.
Yes.
And so this actually brings that connection even more clearly. And of course, we know the story of the night journey, and where the Prophet Muhammad sort of sees all these things and reaches those ranks, and then all the other prophets also eventually reach those ranks, right? And that's why they return in the end times, or in the in this age, to bring about the divine just state.
Exactly.
And I think the concept of Rej'ah and reincarnation is also very much connected to this, because for the true believer, this world is not a prison anymore, and is able to free themselves of its shackles. And I think probably when you really think about it, when it's talking about this world as a prison for the believers, it's probably talking about that rank, that first rank of being a believer. Because as the person progresses, then and reaches that level, which is that level of becoming God in creation, is something that is not really discussed in any of the other versions of Islam, as far as I know. And this rank is something that becomes achieved, and at that level, the world becomes paradise again.
Yeah.
And it becomes a paradise without any limitations. So it's even, because these are people who are completely in alignment with and know God, the absolute God, and they become manifestations of that God, and
Yes.
they're able to realize it and make the
Yes.
conditions of this world very similar. So.
And it's deeply etched in the human psyche that we all strive to be like someone. We model ourselves on someone. We have these hero figures. Kids have posters of Superman on their wall, and they aspire to be like him because they see him as the highest manifestation of what a man can be. Some people go for sports stars, famous footballers and whatnot. But who better to become like than God? As a role model, to become as much like God as possible. And of course, a lot of people will be saying blasphemy, this, that, the other. Well, the whole concept of the 99 names and attributes of God, for you to do incantations of these names, is so that you may reflect that name within your own being. This is the key thing. And to have God as a role model is really, really the crucial thing that you have to recognize, because there is no one better than God. There is nobody wiser than God, nobody more generous than God, nobody more merciful than God. And every prophet messenger that came to a certain degree reflected God in the creation, so that the people may look upon this individual, see the attributes of God manifested in his morals and manners, and become like him. Yes. This is why God puts his spirit in a man, that we may emulate that man, and through him become like God in creation. This is a vital point that the people have to understand and recognize. You can say the names of God 1,000 times, but when you see a man appointed by God with his spirit acting in the way that he does and being in close proximity with him, that's when you also begin to reflect the names of God. And that is the fastest way to know God and to reach God. Okay, excellent. Thank you very much for your time, Professor Razfar. I really enjoyed that conversation. It was very stimulating. And of course, we know there is a very famous Hadith al-Qudsi, we'll probably end this segment on this point, where there is this conversation that is recounted between one of the great prophets of God, Prophet David. And in it, God says to Prophet David something along the lines of, and I'll do my best to try and get the words out. It's a beautiful narration. God says to Prophet David, to King David, he says, you want and I want.
And it shall not be except for what I want. So do as I want, and I shall give you what you want.
Oppose me in what I want, and I will exhaust you, and you will grow tired in what you want. And in the end, it shall not be except as I want. And this is
such a beautiful finality to it, you know, like it just has that. Yeah, it's amazing. I love
and it's basically God saying, David, become like me, because there is no one better than me.
Choose what I choose, want what I want, and then everything will be fine.
Everything will be fine. The world will be a better place. Exactly. So thank you, Professor Razfar, for joining us.
Thank you for your time so much, Professor Razfar. I really loved that conversation.
Thank you so much. God bless you.
God bless you.
Wow, what a topic. I love the topic of freedom, Aria.
I do too.
It's a phenomenal
Never get
topic.
enough of it. We could do every show should be about that. And in fact, it really is, because isn't that what we're aspiring towards?
Yes.
When we say freedom, you have to understand, we're not talking about the freedom that people think is freedom. We're talking about actually living, actually breathing. Being truly alive means to truly know our Creator, to truly know the entity that wanted that we exist and that we know Him.
Yes.
And it comes back to that same Hadith al-Qudsi, again, the other one, which says, I was a hidden treasure and I wanted to be known. That's what God wants. And knowing God is to worship God. Worshipping God is to know God. But you can't do that without a man from Him, can you?